daar zijn we met een nieuwe aflevering van Vivo Valentine. Vandaag te gast Mark Gober, all the way from the USA. Hij is auteur, hij is podcastmaker en ook eigenlijk filosoof. Hij heeft een boek geschreven, Een einde aan de omgekeerde wereld van vrijheid. Het ligt hier op tafel. Het is net uit en we gaan dit gesprek voeren. Ik doe het in het Engels, dus is je Engels niet zo goed? Check eventjes dat vinkje op YouTube en dan vertaalt het automatisch, ondertitelt het automatisch. Je weet zelf. Goed, Mark, welcome in the studio, man. Welcome to Vivo Valentine.
Thank you so much, Boris.
You're from California?
California, Maryland. I'm kind of all over the place right now.
All right, sounds good. You're touring the Netherlands.
Yes.
For your new book, Een einde aan de omgekeerde wereld van vrijheid. It's a libertarian book, to some extent. I don't want to spoil too much right now, but we'll get into that during this podcast. You've written a couple of books before this one. One about health, and the other one was about politics, I think.
So I've written 7 books.
7 books.
Only 2 translated into Dutch. One on medicine, one on liberty.
Okay.
But the other books are on consciousness, cosmology, the Great Reset, many other topics.
I find this fascinating because I have to explain. I mean, usually I do this podcast with Robert. Robert used to be the frontman of the Dutch Libertarian Party. And we've discussed all these libertarian subjects. And we always tend to go towards the spiritual. And we don't really know why. It catches our interest and there's a lot to talk about. And then I saw your resume and I was listening to your podcast. You have a podcast called Where's My Mind, which is about how consciousness is basically the elementary part of reality. I love that. I can recommend this to everyone. Just go and listen to Where's My Mind from Mark Gober. But I was wondering, how did you, where in this whole trajectory did you discover libertarianism?
Okay. So let me take you back because I never even planned on writing books. I'm surprised still that I write books. Uh-huh. I graduated from Princeton University in the US for my undergraduate. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life in any way. So I went into investment banking, which is what a lot of my classmates do. I worked in New York in 2008 during the financial crisis. I was at UBS working on Park Avenue. So this is a big global investment bank. And from there, I left after a little under 2 years, and I joined a firm in Silicon Valley advising technology-focused companies on their intellectual property, so their patents, and also their technology strategy, their business strategy. So that was the world I was in. And that entire time, I didn't really have a sense of why we exist. I was just going through the motions in the job and trying to succeed. And long story short, I had an awakening when I started to listen to podcasts that challenged my worldview. Basically, of why we exist. So that led to my first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, which is similar to my podcast, Where Is My Mind? It has more detail. And that was published in 2018. Where Is My Mind podcast was produced and published in 2019, still available today. And then I left my firm where I had become a partner in Silicon Valley. I said, I need to focus on these other things. I wrote my second book, An End to Upside Down Living, right as COVID was starting. So beginning of lockdowns, which was it's a book about personal development, spiritual awakening. And then I saw what was happening in the world. Because at that point, I was not a political person at all. I didn't even know the difference between left and right, Democrat, Republican. I really I know
nobody
it sounds...
does, really.
But I really didn't because I was so focused on other areas. Politics didn't matter to me. And then it mattered for many reasons because of COVID. We saw, especially in the US, the left tend to be more in favor of lockdowns, in favor of strict measures, the jab, all those sorts of things. Whereas, let's say the right more generally was more about freedom. So that was my first exposure to politics. And I thought it really mattered because all of us, everyone in the world was dealing with this sort of thing. And also I was being asked, Mark, what do you think about these political issues? And I was finding that there would be people who agreed with, let's say, my first 2 books in my podcast series who would have different views about politics. So I was confused because I'd say, how could you have this view of consciousness and then not agree on the politics part? I need to have an opinion on this. And then also there was the Trump-Biden election, which everyone was talking about, and I wanted to learn. So I was researching as much as I could to try to catch up on politics. And as I was alluding to, at first I was drawn more to the right because they were more pro-freedom. But as I looked into it more and more, it wasn't fully free. And then I became exposed to libertarian, anarchist, anarcho-capitalist thinking.
How did you get exposed to that?
I don't remember exactly the first time. I just...
was it a specific podcast or a book or that you read? Or
the first book that really swayed me was Larkin Rose's The Most Dangerous Superstition. I would recommend that to your audience. It's okay. For many people, it's their awakening book. I had heard Larkin Rose speak somewhere, and he talked about his book, and people said, you have to read this, The Most Dangerous Superstition. So I read that, and it's basically flipping the script on what most people believe about government.
Yeah.
And government as tyrannical rather than this benevolent force.
Yeah.
And then I learned about the Austrian School of Economics and started to read Murray Rothbard.
And you had an economic background? So
yes. From my business background, and at Princeton, I didn't major in economics, but actually when I first got to Princeton, I thought I was going to be an economics major. So I took many economics courses and then switched to psychology. So my thesis at Princeton was on behavioral economics.
Yeah, and psychology and sociology and economics are all part of the same coin, I think. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So you, and then, I mean, you've lived through 2008 on Wall Street.
Yeah.
You had this Princeton economics education, and then you discovered Austrian economics. How does that, I mean, I can imagine that you'd be looking at that, you go like, no, it doesn't work like that.
Well, I looked at it and said, this makes sense. And everything I learned before, I was always trying to force it to make sense because people told me it was true. And at the time, I wasn't really questioning.
Yeah.
I said, wow, this is the most logical way of looking at the world that I've ever come across. I need to learn everything I can. Mm-hmm. So I was absorbing every book possible. And I realized it's all based on simple principles. It's actually not complicated. And then I said, I need to write a book about this and then tie it to my prior work on consciousness because there's actually a relationship between the political, the economic, and the metaphysical theories.
We really have to delve into that, in where libertarian meets the metaphysical part. But before we do that, I want to know how did you get through COVID and especially the discussions? Because I can imagine, I mean, any university education makes you violently go to the left, at least here in Europe. And I can imagine for a large part it's the same in the US. How did you navigate it? I mean, when all your friends are sort of like believing the official story from the big pharma industry.
It was a big challenge, but I was already drifting away from my prior network because I had written these two other books that were, on consciousness. And that's not what a lot of people that I worked with, for example, were thinking about. So I was already drifting away. But then I was, like I said, confused because there would be people on the more spiritual side who were leaning left. Yeah. And then people from my prior world, from the business world, let's say, who were also leaning left and were listening to the mainstream media and were not seeing the censorship. Yeah. And I couldn't believe it. So it was a disorienting period for me because I didn't know where I stood on anything and I didn't have many people that I could align with. I was fortunate because I had just left my firm. So I wasn't in a job where I had to deal with that on a day-to-day basis. I had a bit more time to be isolated, and I didn't have to face as much as other people did. But it was unavoidable because especially as the jab rolled out, for those who didn't take the jab, sometimes I was excluded from events. You can't come for not taking the jab, things like that. But to me, the principles are what matter most, and I was going to stick with it. And what I found is that I've now brought in other people in my life who are more aligned. That's been a pattern that I find is that I have to go out on a limb where it seems like it's a crazy idea. And then when I do it, I find other people who are like me. And
because that's something, especially in Europe, libertarianism is not, it hardly exists. And pre-COVID, it was very hard to find. COVID did a lot for libertarianism because it opened people's eyes on the role of the government. But I remember myself, I was lucky to have a lot of friends who had the same opinion as I did. But I know stories of people who were completely alone, who were shut out by their entire network, lost their jobs, had basically no idea what to do. They found our podcast, for instance, or other podcasts or other platforms, and found like-minded people. But the process of realizing that you're basically someone who's not who doesn't want to be ruled by the rulers. this is not something that you just read a book like, I'm just going to change my whole opinion on everything. How did that work for you?
It takes time. And I've had some experience with this now of changing my paradigm. So I'm somewhat accustomed to saying, okay, there's something new. I know this is probably correct, but now I have to unwind all of my old thinking.
Yeah.
It did not happen overnight. But what I tend to do is I immerse myself fully. And the deeper I go and the faster I do it, the more it just becomes part of me. And then I was in, and I looked at everything in a political sense differently, because I was looking at it as tyrannical on both sides. And I was looking at, well, which politicians are being less tyrannical than others? That was my new lens.
Yeah. And was there any part of 2008 that resonated with this new economic sort of perception?
Somewhat. I mean, I was just an analyst when I worked in New York, meaning I was the bottom person on the bottom rank. So I was taking orders from people who knows where and just creating PowerPoint slides and price charts and stock prices and things like that. So I didn't really know what was happening, but I did see that there were not all of the characters there were the best.
Okay.
And I would also say my business experience after that, even in Silicon Valley, I saw a lot of corruption in the world, both in the legal system, because I worked with intellectual property, so I was involved in some court cases and trials, and I saw corruption in that world. I saw also corruption in the media, because I worked with many companies that were innovating with ideas that challenged very big companies.
Yeah.
So you can imagine what a big company would do to a small company to try to shut them out and then steal their technology.
Absolutely.
So I saw that dynamic at play and how they could use and weaponize the government to try to change the laws even. Yeah. So I had some priming for this. So when I came across these libertarian ideas, it just completely made sense.
Wow, that's great. I know an example of the Coca-Cola logo that had its trademark expired. And there was a designer who worked with it, who applied for the patent after it or registered it or something like that. And he got it. It was awarded to him. And then there was a sort of a court case, and he didn't stand a chance. And there was no legal framework whatsoever. He just lost everything. They just took everything from him. It was like, we'll make an example out of you. And that just ruined him.
It's exactly what happens with all kinds of intellectual property. What I learned very clearly is that the law is actually not objective, and that we don't have checks and balances in the way they say, because who's checking all the people in the government, including the judiciary people? There's no outside force checking all of that.
Yeah, that's true. And can you give me an example of that?
So let's say there are corrupt judges.
Yeah.
What do you do?
Yeah, well, that's the Supreme Court, and what if they are corrupt?
And what if they're corrupt?
And what if the president is corrupt? Yeah, of course, it goes all the way to the top.
All the way to the top. So there's no one checking the government itself. We say in the U.S. we have the checks and balances system. There are these different branches that are supposed to check each other, but who's checking them?
Yeah.
There's no one.
Yeah.
So you end up with this political monopoly
Crazy.
that runs a given jurisdiction.
Yeah. No, that's insane. So you became a libertarian, and I mean, you've written so many books, and it feels to me, and I've only read this one, Einde aan de omgekeerde wereld van vrijheid. The title is insane. It's so long, but I've only read this one, and it feels like you do a study to a certain subject, and you need to write the book to actually sort of complete the study, or to put all your thoughts onto paper, so it materializes. So that's the way it feels when I read it.
Yeah, it's very perceptive. That's how my process works, where I learn something and I want to share it with people, and I also want people around me to know about it. Yeah. So I try to explain it logically so that other people can learn what has shifted me so much. Okay. Basically, and every book is like that on different topics. But at the time, for me, this was such an important idea. This was published in the U.S. in 2021. Okay, so right in the heart of everything. Yeah. When everyone was questioning tyranny versus what's the role of government, and I wanted to get it out there. But I will say it was challenging for me, because I knew how many people would be upset with these ideas, and I decided to do it anyway. But
what do you mean upset by? Because what I like about libertarianism is that it's so extremely reasonable. It's all sort of like it's example based. You can just point at something, like you obviously see that this doesn't work. How do you keep defending it. And I mean, the libertarian is always, you don't have to defend yourself. You just point at the obvious. It doesn't work. Government doesn't work. Democracy doesn't really work. You can just point at it and give the examples. How do you get any? For me, it's easy. I never really get any discussion about it.
That's what I thought. But then I had some people who used to support me who basically said, this is crazy.
Oh, yeah?
They couldn't get it. And often it happens in, let's say, the spiritual world, where we talk about people being interconnected, and there's scientific evidence for that. And it somehow leads to a communistic perspective of how are you being so selfish, Mark, that you're saying people should have private property? That is so evil.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the kind of reaction I get. Or if we don't have this Leviathan state, they wouldn't use those words, then there will be complete chaos. Mark, I can't believe you're doing this. This is dangerous.
Yeah. But both those arguments, I feel, are built on top of an idea of guilt. They feel guilty about something. Like, I'm pretty sure that in Germany during COVID, they had the worst like social pressure on taking the jab and all these measures that they took, because they still feel guilty about the war. For some reason that sort of resonates. And if we say we do this for each other and we do this to save grandma and all these stupid arguments, they work, they resonate with these people because they feel like they're doing something wrong. And I can imagine, I don't know, but I've seen it, people who are rich or who not necessarily made the money themselves, but inherited, or their parents are rich, they deep down, they feel guilty that they have something, and they see all this poverty around them, all this trouble around them, but they have something, and they tend to become communists because of that. Is that something that you recognize?
Yeah, I think it happens perhaps among wealthy, but also among intellectual elites. Mm-hmm. And that is in part due to the academia, the setting in academia where there's so much, let's say, philosophical leftism there.
But why does it resonate there on academia?
Part of it might be that people they grow up with it, so they don't know anything else, and they believe the propaganda. So these perspectives are so foreign, and they will say, well, how could that be true? If I learned from some of the great professors, you're telling me this other idea, so all these professors are wrong? Yeah. I find that people have a hard time with that.
Especially maybe if they invest a lot of money in an education, if they spend $100,000, $200,000, and then somebody tells them, like, sorry, everything you learned, it's nonsense.
Yes.
Yeah.
And also part of the elitism is a belief that some people know what's best for others, and they have a right and actually a duty to impose it on the people who are lesser. So it's a view that some people are better than others without saying it, and it's masked as compassion, is that we want to do it to help you.
Yeah, we're here to help. We're from the government. We're here to help. Yeah, that's what I like about Thomas Sowell, who wrote that brilliant book, Intellectuals and Society, and he describes this as the idea makers, or like ideas are something that you produce, and when you go to a university, then you become the best idea producer, and that's why their nonsense ideas are actually regarded. I saw this example of, I don't know if you saw that on the Olympics, on the last Olympics, there was this breakdancer from Australia, this girl, and she couldn't breakdance at all, but she had a PhD in some social studies where she was studying girls or women in b-boying and in, I don't know, in the ghettos of Sydney or something, and she couldn't dance at all, but she just participated in it because she was an expert, quote unquote expert, and she couldn't do it at all. And we see a lot of those experts. They have PhDs, but they don't know anything. They can't produce anything.
Right. And even from, let's say, the Austrian School of Economics perspective, even if someone does know a lot, it's literally impossible to know people's preferences on a society level or even at an individual level.
Yeah.
For example, let's say you really like chocolate cake, and you're going to be buying chocolate cake in the marketplace a lot for years. And one day you decide, I like apple pie more.
Yeah.
And then you start buying apple pie. And that's just your dessert preferences. And imagine how many other preferences you have in the marketplace and multiply that by every person in society. I don't care what degree you have. Yeah. There's no person who can centrally plan an economy when you have unpredictable subjective preferences.
Why do they keep trying?
I think a lot of it's conditioning, because we grow up in a system where there is a centrally planned everything. That's what we grew up in. How could you have a society without that? And given that we need to have some smart people who know how to steer our economy and our world, then it's actually benevolent and compassionate to do so.
Is it also that people maybe sort of like live with the idea that they cannot take responsibility themselves, and they find it easier to have other people take this responsibility, even though they don't know what they're doing, but it doesn't matter because then you live in a world where you're not all by yourself, and your health and your education and your food and everything that you rely on others, that it's sort of managed well, when in reality it isn't managed at all. I can imagine that it's a flaw in thinking. And I'm always surprised that it's so easy to indoctrinate people. And I think there was I don't know who said it, but the more intellectual and the more smart or the higher the EQ, the easier it is to indoctrinate people. And that I find it fascinating, and you see it every day. And I always wonder, I woke up to this, you woke up to this, you've written all these books about it. Why doesn't the majority of academia wake up to this and just see the nonsense?
I think there are two factors. The first one is the most benign, which is that people have egos. And if they grew up in a certain way of thinking, if they've written papers and books and built a career around a certain philosophy, it's very difficult to say, I was wrong by a lot, and I'm going to change my entire philosophy. So there's some of that, especially among people who have many degrees, because they've been told their whole life that they're the smart people, they're the intellectual elite. Yeah. And then I think there might be a top-down element of this. And it's something I've seen especially in the realm of consciousness science. So studying, let's just say, phenomena that are outside the norm. And I know many of these scientists perfectly. The example I'm going to give is from a neuroscientist in Canada who was told by the head of the institute, the Neurological Institute, that he would not be allowed to study any spiritual phenomena as long as this person was alive. And his opinion was, this is social engineering. Yeah. So I think there's an element of that too. Something from the top saying, you're going to teach this, whether it's consciousness, whether it's politics, economics, there's a certain philosophy you're going to be imprinting on the students. Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. And what fascinates me is how you change that. Because, you went to a really expensive college. You started your career, you invested heavily, probably living in New York. It wasn't cheap. No. Doing your internship probably at a company where, life is expensive there. So you probably didn't have a lot of money. Then you move to California. All this investment into this career. And then you discover all these subjects and you sort of like switch the knob and you discover something else. Yeah. Why doesn't everybody do that? What makes you different there in that respect? Well, it wasn't an easy decision. It was the right one to do. And it took me some time because my first, let's say, awakening was in 2016 when I started to learn about consciousness. And I didn't leave my firm until the end of 2019, early 2020. Yeah. So there was a bit of a lag where I was learning more and more. But I really immersed myself in that period where I got to the point that I was a different person philosophically, where the things that I valued in life were fundamentally different. Yeah. And I couldn't continue on a path that didn't feel fully aligned. And I said, I don't even know what I'm going to do next. I didn't know I was going to be writing books. Yeah. I just knew I had to leave where I was because it was taking too much of my energy. And I said, I have to do this. So there was a conviction that I had that came from the years of doing that intense research. But also even prior to 2016, I had spent so much time on this track of the mainstream and trying to work my way up the ladder in so many ways. And I saw that it doesn't work. It's a dead end. It's like running on a treadmill. How did you see that? I saw it in myself, that it didn't lead to greater happiness or satisfaction, really. It led to actually more suffering in many ways. Yeah. And I looked at the people around me who were very successful in many ways. And I just said, is this really all life is? Yeah. Because they weren't even that satisfied or happy. They were looking for the same things. It was never ending. There was never enough. And there wasn't a greater purpose or meaning behind all of it. So I just had to get off the treadmill. Yeah, I completely understand. So how did the subject of consciousness come up? Where did you start to ask yourself these questions that led to the writing of these books and the podcast? in 2016, I just started listening to podcasts in general, because at that time they weren't as popular. They were on the rise. And initially I was listening to the Tim Ferriss show, which is very popular. And he has lots of investors on his show. So that was interesting to me, but also alternative health.
Yeah.
So that led me on a path to then explore other alternative health podcasts. There's one in particular called Extreme Health Radio that I was listening to. And on that show, they interviewed a woman who talked about using her psychic abilities to work with clients to help guide their life. And this was on a health podcast, and the woman sounded very serious about it. Okay. I wasn't sure if she was totally crazy or what was going on, but that led me to listen to other podcasts where I saw there was scientific evidence for this sort of thing.
How did you, because what I find fascinating, and I think that's a very libertarian thing to do, that you come up with a subject like that and you start to look for scientific merit, so a way you want to prove it. You don't just want to see it, but you want to know what you're seeing or what you're understanding. And that's what I really like about it. But go on.
No, it's exactly what happened, because there was the initial podcast on Extreme Health Radio. This was just one person making claims about her life. Yeah. But then I heard many, many other people saying basically the same thing. Mm-hmm. They had no relation to each other, different ages, different genders, different nationalities and backgrounds. So I couldn't understand what was going on, because I didn't think they were all colluding because they were so separate. There wasn't some conspiracy among these people, but I wasn't sure if they were just delusional or if they were missing something in the same way. And that led me to explore. And I realized there was an entire body of science that I had never heard about, including, interestingly, there was a lab at Princeton University, which I didn't know about when I was there because it was so controversial. It was run by the Dean of Engineering, Dr. Robert John, where he was studying the influence of the mind on physical matter. So basically asking people to affect the behavior of machines using the intention of their mind, and even asking people to try to see things with their mind far away, called remote viewing. This was being done at Princeton for almost 30 years.
Cool.
So I realized there was a lot of scientific evidence. The U.S. government was looking into this. And then I said, okay, if even 1% of this is true, I need to understand how that could be.
And when I listen to your podcast, Where's My Mind? It all seems very focused, like you always knew it was about consciousness. But I can imagine that in this journey of sort of discovering or researching the subject, you go in all different directions before you somehow find consciousness as a unifying factor.
That's a very perceptive, because it didn't start with that. It started with a number of what I would call anomalies, things that didn't make sense in the paradigm that I was taught, whether it was a woman claiming she spoke with other beings in other dimensions, or like the University of Virginia, they study young children who talk about a life that's not their own, like a past life, quote unquote. And the researchers at the University of Virginia find historical records that validate what the kids say.
Oh, that's
or
cool.
People having near-death experiences, like Dr. Pim van Lommel, the Dutch cardiologist, published in the Lancet Medical Journal. So these are credentialed people in these various areas, and they sound like they're disconnected. So communicating with other dimensions, past lives, near-death experiences, what's the commonality? It all relates to consciousness and the brain and what's actually happening. So you're right, it was at the very end that I put together that it was all around consciousness, but it started with these disparate areas.
Yeah, I can imagine. And because I've been sort of like following these subjects for a long time. I really like that. And there's a book called, and I mentioned this a lot in the podcast. Sorry to all the listeners who are hearing it for the 10th time, but there's a book called The Case Against Reality by Donald Hoffman. And he basically has this thesis that if in quantum physics time and space cannot exist, then time and space don't exist. And that's what I really like about that is that it's just as in libertarianism. If something is so obvious, then let's start with the obvious and figure the rest out from there, instead of like, okay, we have physics and it doesn't really connect with quantum physics. It's different. Let's try to figure out a theory of everything where we can all have all these inputs and sort of like mix it together so that it works. That's not the way to do it. You just start with the obvious and work from there, and you work backwards, forwards, whatever. And I really like this idea that you somehow came up with this concept of consciousness. I mean, it's not a concept, but this idea that all matter comes from consciousness. That basically consciousness is the unifying element in reality. And tell me more about this. Where did it start?
Well, let me start with the inverse of that, which is known as materialism or physicalism. Mm-hmm. And I had never heard those terms until I started to research, but they represent the paradigm that most of us grow up with, especially in the education system, which is that everything in the world can be reduced to physical matter, like atoms. And it's from atoms, actually more specifically a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. Mm-hmm. And there were lots of particles colliding basically in a huge universe. And then after many, many years of evolution, a human being emerges, develops a brain, and from the brain pops out our consciousness. That's the story. And when your body dies and when your brain shuts off, that's the end of your consciousness. Yeah. That's the view of materialism. Uh-huh. And that's what I thought was true. So if you believe that, it basically says life is completely random. When you die, that's the end of your consciousness. There's no possibility that your consciousness, because it's stuck in your skull, it could never be outside of your immediate location. It's stuck in here. You could never send your consciousness somewhere far away in space and time. That's not possible. And the inverse of that would be, what if consciousness is first and everything that we call the material world is actually within consciousness? One of the reasons I like that is that it aligns with our experience. Mm-hmm. We don't know anything outside of consciousness. It's actually not even verifiable. Because if something existed outside of anyone's consciousness, you wouldn't know it until you observed it within your consciousness, and then it's within your consciousness. So all experience is within consciousness.
Yeah. And what I find fascinating is that there's all these examples of where this was mentioned, and it is packaged into religion. It is packaged into old culture, maybe, or pagan religion. That's where there's all these references to something like this. And whether it is that when we die, we go to heaven or whatever, I mean, it's all basically the same. And that there is something that's bigger than life. It unites us. And but within these three dimensions that we live in, yeah, it's very hard for us to grasp this. What sort of scientific research has been done to prove this?
Well, I think in terms of proving it, it's challenging. But there are pieces of evidence that point us more in this direction of a consciousness-centric metaphysics versus one that's focused on matter. Uh-huh. So, for example, let's say the near-death experience, where a person is in some kind of physiological trauma. Cardiac arrest is a good example because the person, their heart stops beating, blood stops flowing to the brain, and based on what we know about the brain in mainstream neuroscience, at that point, the person should not be able to have clear cognition, let's say. Yeah. And what happens in many of these cases is that people say it was realer than real at a time when they were clinically dead. They could see with 360-degree vision, and this is the really important point. Sometimes they can see things or even hear them from a vantage point outside their body. So they're on an operating table in a hospital, and their consciousness is somehow above it or even in the other room. They're resuscitated, and they come back, and they tell the doctor, they tell family members, I heard you say this, I saw you do this, and they say that's impossible because we know what was happening to your body at that time. You should not have been able to tell me something that was accurate, let alone from a perspective outside your body. Yeah. So these are called veridical out-of-body experiences. There's a book called The Self Does Not Die that has more than 100 of these cases that are well documented. You can imagine they're hard to document all this. Yeah. There should be 0 cases ever. Yeah. The important part of this is you have a consciousness that is not only functional, but it's accurate because the memories are verified by other people.
Even if the brain doesn't work.
When the brain doesn't work. Yeah. How can that be? So that means it's not a hallucination. So
that means that who we are does not live inside our bodies. Our body is an extension of who we are.
That's the implication.
Yeah, that's very interesting. How does that fit into the idea that we only Donald Hoffman's idea that we only live in with our physical bodies in these 3 dimensions, because that's for somehow that's the optimum situation for us to feed ourselves, to survive, to breathe. I mean, what is there in other dimensions? Is consciousness in other dimensions, or is it part of the three dimensions?
Yeah, this is a very difficult question to validate. And there are many examples of this. So I wrote a book called An End to Upside Down Contact. That was my fourth book, the one right after the Liberty book.
Yeah.
And it explores examples in which human beings or human consciousness is having contact with non-human intelligence. And often it's in other dimensions.
Yes.
Sometimes people will call that spirits or aliens or whatever you want to call it. They might be referring to the same thing, but their consciousness is in some other world. And this can happen in a near-death experience because people will say, not only could I see 360 degrees, I could see what was happening on the operating table, but there were beings that came to see me. Intelligences, a being of light. Some people will say it was a religious figure. Some people will say it was a deceased relative, and there might be multiple beings. So their consciousness is having contact. We see something also with psychedelics. People, like Dr. Rick Strassman at the University of New Mexico with DMT, dimethyltryptamine, he was injecting people with it. What happened? Their body was in one place. Their consciousness was interacting with other beings.
Yeah.
And he actually had to stop the study because he said, I don't know if I can subject people to this. I don't know what's going on. It's unethical. So there might be things happening that our body is actually blocking, like a blindfold.
Yeah.
In some way.
Do you have any experiences yourself?
I don't.
Okay. No magic mushroom trips where you okay.
No, but I've talked to many people who have had these experiences. I don't really desire it because it's not always pleasant, I should say. Okay. I talk about that in the Contact book. Many of these beings seem to be malicious. Not all of them. So there's a spectrum.
Okay, all right. But you say for me it seems logical to think that if we actually take our consciousness, but that lives outside these three dimensions, and all our consciousness is part of the same source, whatever it is, but it's coming from the same source. That if you talk about aliens or beings in other dimensions, they're also part of the same source. So if you meet them, the moment you step out of these three dimensions, sometimes my dog, he stares into nothing, or my cat can do that too. He goes like this, or my dog is like looking at something, like, I don't know what I'm seeing, but I'm seeing he's looking at something, I don't see it. But then I feel like maybe just these animals, they see a little bit more than we do. And in a way, maybe they see something in another dimension.
I think it's possible. And even think about it from a traditional scientific perspective. The electromagnetic spectrum of light, human beings only see a tiny little fraction. We know that. We know there are X-rays and infrared, all sorts of light sources that our eyes don't see ordinarily. Yeah. So there could be other things that our body actually just blocks out.
Yeah.
And it could be that other beings like animals and other, maybe insects even, have different areas of perception that we don't.
Yeah, because one of the things that really spoke to me in your podcast was the idea that your brain is not an antenna for consciousness, but is actively blocking parts of conscious awareness for some reason.
Right.
Can you explain this to me? How does this work?
So let me just give the context here. The traditional perspective in neuroscience is that the brain creates our consciousness. And the reason many people believe that is there are strong correlations between what happens in the brain and what happens to our consciousness. Let's say someone gets in a car accident, damages a part of the brain that's responsible for some kind of memory. The person has memory loss. And we say, look, the brain creates consciousness. Why is that not necessarily true? And I'll give an example that's not a perfect metaphor. But let's say you're watching television and you take a hammer to the antenna on the television, and all of a sudden the TV show that you're watching, it's very scratchy on the screen. And it's not because the signal has been damaged. It's only the apparatus that was being used to process the signal that was damaged. So what if the brain is some kind of an interface, like an antenna? Yeah. Now the next layer is, where you were going is, what if it's not just a receiver of consciousness, or some would say even a transmitter too? What if it's actually getting in the way? It's reshaping the signal into something that's less clear than the outside world or than the broader reality. So in a near-death experience, when the person's clinically dead or close to it, the brain's basically gone and the consciousness has expanded. So maybe our bodies and our brain, this whole system, is somehow limiting our perspective, and there's a much broader reality, and we're just ignorant of it.
Yeah. There were some examples of people with extreme forms of autism that could do, recite 12,000 books, sort of word for word, something like that. And there was no way to explain this. And the idea was that what if some form of brain damage actually also took out the blockage and give you access to a world of information.
Right.
And then how do you connect this to libertarianism? Because that's basically what your book, your last book, is about.
Yes. Well, the book is divided into, let's just say, two general sections. I know it's not exactly that way. But the first is the political and the economic theory from a traditional standpoint. So, and I'm sure your audience is familiar with many of these ideas of challenging the notion of the state. Mm-hmm. What is the state? Is it actually there to protect us, or is it inherently tyrannical? So I go through those arguments and try to summarize it in one place, and then go through the Austrian School of Economics and say, look, actually central planning and having an outside force come in to tell us how to run the economy is very problematic for many reasons. And that leads toward the principle that's known as non-aggression. Very simple, which is don't initiate any aggression towards anyone's body or the property they own. And aggression could be physical violence, fraud, theft, coercion, anything like that. Mm-hmm. And property is land, money, anything that you rightfully own. The kicker is that you have a right to self-defense if someone initiates aggression against you or your property. Very simple. But when I was learning about these libertarian ideas and the non-aggression principle, I said, wow, this is very similar to what I've learned in consciousness studies. And this is the link. So if we go back to the near-death experience, there's a phenomenon that I haven't mentioned yet. It's called the life review. And you might not have gotten to this in the podcast yet. It's episode 6.
Okay.
And Where is My Mind?
Yeah. Okay.
The life review. It's reported in 20 to 30% of near-death experience cases where a person relives his or her whole life in an instant or in some kind of short period of time. Mm-hmm. And they become each person that they affected during their life and see what it was like to receive that. So in the podcast, I interviewed Daniel Brinkley, who's had 4 near-death experiences.
Whoa.
He was struck by lightning. He had open heart surgery twice, brain surgery once. Each time he had a near-death experience and was resuscitated, and he had a life review. So he told me about his combat days in Vietnam, mm-hmm. where he had to relive during his life review, killing people in combat and what it was like to be killed by him.
Whoa.
And he felt the pain from the children who no longer had fathers because he had killed the fathers in combat. So he comes back from his life review and says, I got to change everything, which is not uncommon. Mm-hmm. He became much less materialistic, and he became a hospice volunteer. So in his later life reviews, in the near-death experiences he had later, because he didn't know he was going to have them, he got to experience what it was like to be the person dying in the bed and being comforted by him.
Yeah.
So he felt the good and the bad. The point here is that there seems to be something about morality that we learn in these other dimensions that our brain and our body normally block out. And Dr. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia, this is a medical doctor, he wrote a book called After, published in 2021 in the US, where he says, in reviewing many of these cases of near-death experience survivors, it's actually beyond morality what they're talking about. They're talking about natural law. This notion of a golden rule, that we should treat other people well because at some level of reality that we don't see, we are the same, and that's how you could become them in a life review, in the near-death experience.
That's a non-aggression principle.
The non-aggression principle.
Yeah.
So that's, to me, the tie. So the non-aggression principle is spiritually aligned, and the current way that we do politics around the world, which is statism, which is a compulsory political monopoly that has a monopoly of violence and all these things that we talk about all the time, is violating spiritual principles.
Wow. It's also very nice to know that when our former Minister of Health dies, that he will go through all the misery that he caused during COVID. That's pretty good. Good to know. Anyways, all right. So I love it that there's a natural law, and I think that a lot of libertarians also use this term a lot to sort of defend libertarianism. What I like about the idea, what really got me into libertarianism was the idea of von Mises, where he was talking about basically about about human action. What drives people? What drives their actions? And that basically they always act in their own self-interest. And this is where I have trouble relating this to the spiritual part if you take it too literally. So if you say you act in your own self-interest, if there's a material component of that is all about money or possession or, I don't know, gathering lots of stuff that you don't really need, there's not much room for spiritual. But if you take this into the spiritual domain, then you can say it goes towards the non-aggression principle, because what drives you is maybe something like a natural law, where there is I don't know, some universal morality which is bigger than whatever's in our three dimensions that drives us. And I find this interesting because if I discuss libertarianism with left-leaning friends who are more on the Marxist side, we agree on a lot of stuff. And we agree that the world is not a good place, that it needs to be better. And they blame large corporations and I blame government. And in the end, does it really matter? You know, what it comes down to is that none of these people who either run these large corporations or run the government adhere to this universal law.
Yeah.
So I find it fascinating that libertarianism is always portrayed as something that's opposite to Marxism because it starts with the individual. But what I'm trying to get at, and I find it really hard to do that in English, but when you say that individual freedom is something that we should all strive to, how can that incorporate on a metaphysical level? How can that incorporate a better world for everyone? How can you bring the world on a spiritual level to a next plateau, let's say, by just looking after yourself? So I know the libertarian economic side of it, but how do you see that spiritually?
To me, the world is a collection of individuals. So it automatically starts with the individual. It has to. There is no collective by itself. The individual is the smallest unit. So as each individual does his or her best and starts to align with these values, that's how the entire sea level rises, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And then also when thinking about it from the perspective of natural law, the non-aggression principle, the notion of self-interest that you mentioned, what is the self that's being referred to? Is it just the physical self or the physical in relation to the metaphysical self that knows that the golden rule is a critical element of it? So to me, it's as each individual starts to have these consciousness shifts, then each individual's behavior will start to change. And then that person will not be acting in a way that violates the non-aggression principle. That person will be taking care of oneself so that the person can then be charitable in other ways. But you have to get solid on your own 2 feet first. That's how I see it. So
then you would say that if you say that, then basically the materialistic part of it, it was another word that you used for it.
Physicalism.
Physicalism, yeah. That part of it, of libertarianism, is actually a problem. Because when you translate self-interest to materialism or physicalism, then you're basically talking about possession. But when you talk about it in a spiritual way, then you talk about aligning with the natural law or larger,
exactly,
something larger.
So what I do in the book, An End to Upside Down Liberty, is talk about a metaphysical political philosophy rather than just political philosophy. Yeah. So political philosophy would be, let's say, statism versus libertarianism, that spectrum. Yeah. But what I did is I added an axis. I said, that's great, we need to have that, but there's also the axis of the spiritual perspective versus the physicalist or the materialist perspective. And what I'm arguing is we need to move more toward the spiritual and toward the libertarian together. Because if you just have the libertarian with the physical, there are problems, like you said. Yeah. So it's like you end up with these 4 quadrants. And the one that I'm arguing we should move towards in the future, the spiritual and the libertarian.
And that's really nice. What will we end up with if that happens? What will the world look like?
A better world. I really think so.
In what way?
Because let's take both parts. The libertarian perspective is we will not have rulers. ultimately. So people will be able to actually be free.
Yeah.
But then those free people with a spiritual mindset would be acting in accordance with the non-aggression principle because of a deeper sense of meaning and purpose and wanting to abide by the golden rule because they feel like it's their metaphysical calling and it's part of natural law. So the structure of government that many people would say we need to have this in order to control everything else, that would not be an argument anymore. In theory, I'm saying this is theoretical.
Yeah. It's becoming a little bit religious in a sense, because it feels like all the rules that the many religions use to sort of like get you to go to the higher plane, you know, if it's life after death or whatever, what they use, but something like that. And the problem with that is that in these three dimensions, we need to survive.
Right.
So this is all fine when we have a big bank account and all the time to do all the mushrooms in the world, but what if you have to survive or you live in war or whatever? How can you move towards a higher metaphysical reality?
Well, I do think survival is in alignment with everything we've discussed because it is taking care of yourself, and if you are part of this greater spiritual interconnectedness, if you ignore your own self, that's not good either from a spiritual perspective.
Yeah.
So that would mean do whatever you can in the world to survive yourself and then be of service to others. And depending where everyone's in a different place on that spectrum, but taking care of yourself in that process is completely acceptable. And arguably the self-defense aspect of the non-aggression principle comes into play too, where if something is threatening your survival, you have a right to be aggressive. And actually it's spiritually important for you to do so.
How do you look at, I mean, if you look at the world and you see all these useless wars and you know, funded by the military-industrial complex or funded by the taxpayer and profited on by the military-industrial complex. If you look at this, and I mean, it looks so hopeless. You know, we're so far from that. Even if there's a few people who understand it, it's not enough.
It's not enough to change the entire system now, and I don't know if we can or if it's even possible, but it starts with a shift in consciousness. That's how I see it.
Yeah.
Because when enough of us start to realize this, then we examine politics from a new lens and start to say no to things that we might have just thought were okay before and now are not. So who knows how it will manifest. But you mentioned the wars, and you also mentioned the debate of Marxism, you know, versus like what's the problem, the government or the corporations. Mm-hmm. It's always government as the container behind all of these things.
Yeah.
We have the wars because the governments are warring. The corporations can be problematic because they can collude with government. And like P.J. O'Rourke says, when buying and selling are controlled by legislation, the first things to be bought and sold are legislators.
Yeah, of course.
So it's never the corporation in isolation. It's never the war in isolation. It's within the container of statism.
Yeah. No, I understand. Okay, so we have to get rid of that. Okay. Then how about the conscious part of it? I mean, if consciousness is the basic element of reality, I mean, that implies that reality is created from consciousness. So it feels a little bit like you're materializing, you know, like okay, you look at something and it's there because you look at it or something. You know, the double slit experiments that I think that you mentioned that in your book as well or in your podcast. If that's true, if basically all of reality is created from consciousness, how do you explain wars and suffering? How is that? I mean, what part of consciousness creates that?
Yeah, one of the biggest philosophical debates out there. Yeah. And the argument that's often given is that we live in some kind of an evolutionary universe. An evolutionary meaning that we are growing at the level of our consciousness. And in the same way that, let's say, an athlete goes to the gym and experiences a lot of pain in the gym physically, but then that person's in great shape afterwards and then wins in sports. You grow through learning and challenges. And that might be what is happening, is that we are moving toward the truth collectively. And in doing so, we are having to, let's say, overcome the darkness that might be there. So I'll give another analogy. Let's say pure consciousness is like the sun that's always shining, and clouds get in the way of it. Mm-hmm. That might be like our world. What we're doing is removing the clouds. Yeah. Now, why are the clouds there in the first place? That would get into origins of the universe, and maybe there's something about We're obscured from the broader reality so that we can have a fully immersive experience. And it's through these challenges that we grow, in the same way that in a video game, you advance to higher and higher levels. And the bad guys get tougher and tougher, but then you're more skilled to be able to overcome them, and then you win in the end. But you have the challenges there. Yeah. That's what some people say, but I don't know.
It's interesting that you mention video games. I know a lot about that. And I mean, the theory that we're actually living in a video game and that the challenges that we face feel very scripted. I mean, what you just explained, that we have to go through a certain stage collectively to level up, it feels like a video game.
Yeah.
Do you think we live in a simulation / video game?
Well, it depends on how we define the terms simulation and video game. So let's say consciousness is fundamental. And I use the analogy from Dr. Bernardo Kastrup of we're like whirlpools within a stream of water. So we're all interconnected at the level of the stream of water, but we're an individual whirlpool at the same time. So it could be that the full stream of water is simulating itself. So the simulator, which is the stream, is also the simulatee, which is the whirlpool, because the whirlpool is the stream at some level. So some part of us is simulating, and we're in the simulation.
And so the water is the consciousness. What if the simulation comes from a higher dimension? So that's why we cannot perceive it, because we're in these 3 dimensions.
It's possible, but if it's not something that a consciousness could ever perceive, we could never verify. Yeah. So it's one possibility out of many. But even the idea that I just mentioned it's beyond the individual perception of the whirlpool, because we can't see it. We can't even perceive the broader stream, but it's still there if we had all of our blinders removed.
Yeah. Yeah, what I really like about Pim van Lommel's book that you mentioned is that most of these near-death experiences that he describes, people, and he's a doctor, so he works in a hospital, so most of these cases are in the hospital. All these people, all these experiences, these people are in the top of the room, so they look down upon the situation. And what I find interesting about that is, imagine that you have 2 people living in a 2D reality, in a 2-dimensional reality, and it's this table, and they are talking, they're living their lives there, and there's a 3D wall in front of them. They won't be able to cross that wall. It's impossible for them because they live in a 2D reality. Right. But we, like you and I, sitting on this table looking at these people, we're living in 3 dimensions, and we look at this table and we go like, what are they worrying about? You know, it's just the wall, it's just there. It's not so high, you can get over it, but they can't because they live in 2-dimensional reality. Yes. And this is what I find interesting about Pim van Lommel's book, is that all these stories seem like they were, like all these troubles, they are in the same way, they go away. Like, what are they worrying about? It's only this or it's only that. It doesn't matter. Like sort of all these quotes, they're always into this sort of, they have this tone to it. And it feels like they're just looking at the whole situation from a higher dimension. So if our consciousness comes from a 4th dimension or from even a higher dimension, it's obvious that whatever's happening in these 3 dimensions is trivial, because the 4th dimension adds an unlimited amount of possibilities to solve the problem.
And one thing to add is that many people come back from near-death experiences saying, there are no words I can use to describe what happened. The term is that it's ineffable. Yeah. So these other dimensions are something we can't even try to discuss. So the questions that you're asking are ones I ask myself too. We might not even be capable of answering the questions, and the questions themselves might not even be relevant, because we're asking them from the 2-dimensional world, when the answer and the question might actually be a 5-dimensional one.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love that. All right, Mark. I think we've come to the end of this regular podcast. We're going to go on for a short time in de extra aflevering. I'm going to switch to Dutch now. We gaan door in de extra aflevering. Voor alle bazige bazen op vivavalentine.com. Ben je nog geen bazige baas? Ga dan naar vivavalentine.com. Je mag daar een bazige baas worden. Je mag zelf bepalen wat het je waard is. En als je dat doet, dan zien we je zo meteen. Na afloop van deze uitzending gaan we direct live daardoor. En doe je dat niet, nou goed, dan zien we je volgende week weer. Doei doei!